Hi, my name is Dr. Ayo Sekai, and I am here to tell you about the power of poetical science discourse in my book K² and the legacy of revolutionary thought. Like many of you, I wear many hats. I'm a scholar, a poet, I'm a publisher, and the author of A², a scholarly poetical science discourse, a book that embodies a discipline at the core of all of my work, poetical science. Today, I want to talk to you about this discipline, a form of discourse that doesn't just blend poetry and science, but elevates both into something revolutionary. A² is not just a book. It's a call to rethink how we approach knowledge. It's a demonstration of how poetry can be an academic tool, one that captures the essence of lived experiences and resists the confines of traditional scholarly discourse. Poetical science discourse, as showcased in A², invite us to reconsider the ways in which we understand, document, and critique our realities. At its core, A² represents a reclamation of knowledge. For centuries, marginalized communities, especially Black communities, have been excluded from traditional academic spaces. The language of Ph.D. pushes back against these boundaries, reminding us that scholarship is not limited to the cold analysis of data or the structured format of journal articles. Scholarship can live in the rhythm of our words, the cadence of our poems, and the stories that we tell. Political science discourses are not a new idea. It has roots in the ways oppressed communities have historically fought for their voice. In times when we were denied access to education and the right to record our own stories, we turned to poetry. We turned to music like hip-hop and oral history. Consider the work of Frederick Douglass. He was a master orator, political thinker, and writer, but he was also a poet at heart. His narrative of the life of Frederick Douglass is not only an account of his journey from slavery to freedom, but a profound example of Ph.D. at work. Douglass wielded the power of metaphor and poetic language to humanize himself and other enslaved people, offering a vision of liberation that extended beyond political theory into hearts and minds of his readers. Langston Hughes, for example, and the Harlem Renaissance. Poets did something similar, blending art and politics to confront systematic racism. Hughes' poem, Let America Be America Again, is a sharp political critique that uses the lyricism of poetry to inspire action. These poets didn't separate their art from their activism. They understood that the power of language could change minds and challenge oppressive systems. In academic research, Ph.D. also breaks the mold of rigid Eurocentric methodologies. Ethnographically, the study of cultures often embraces this interdisciplinary approach. For example, Zora Neale Hurston, both an anthropologist and a writer, used her deep connection to storytelling to bring forth the voices of Black Southerners in her ethnographic work. Hurston used the dialect of song and narrative in Mules and Men and shows how poetry and storytelling can make academic work more accessible, real, and relevant to the people it represents. In today's scholarship, there is a growing recognition of the importance of qualitative research, which includes narrative, life histories, and lived experiences. But Ph.D. goes way beyond this. It's not just about telling stories, it's about using the artistry of poetry to convey complex ideas. Like Audre Lorde's The Master's Tool Will Never Dismantle the Master's House is a critique of systems of oppression, yet it reads like poetry. Her writing is precise and powerful, each word carrying a depth of meaning that challenges both academic and societal norms. Ph.D. reminds us that scholarship is not just intellectual. It is emotional, it's spiritual, it's cultural. It urges us to resist the divide between the analytical and the artistic. Our lives, our struggles, and our histories are too complex to be contained by data alone. So in A Squared, I decided to explore ethnography, the study of lived experiences, by blending the poetic and the scientific. For generations, Black communities have relied on poetry, music, and storytelling to document our histories. The griots of West Africa were the original historians, keeping alive the stories of their people through song and verse. Similarly, in the Americas, enslaved Africans used spirituals and oral traditions to retain their histories and pass on the knowledge. The freedom poets of the Harlem Renaissance and the protest poets of the Civil Rights Movement carried forward this tradition, embedding resistance into their work. They understood that poetry wasn't just about art, it was a weapon against oppression. A Square situates itself in this lineage, using poetical science discourse to challenge traditional notions of history, politics, and identity. So, in today's social science research, political science discourse continues to hold space for narratives that traditional scholarship often overlooks. For instance, A Square highlights how Black women whose voices have been confined to domestic spaces have used poetry to challenge those confinements and expand the possibilities of their intellectual, political, and emotional lives. It critiques how mainstream academic research fails to account for the nuanced experiences of marginalized groups and instead offers an alternative and interdisciplinary, culturally rooted approach to scholarship that honors the full scope of human experience. In this sense, poetical science discourse is not just about expression, it's about activism. We see this in the work of poets like Claude McKay, whose famous poem, "If We Must Die," rallied the spirit of resistance during the Harlem Renaissance. It is this poem that reads like a manifesto for dignity, urging oppressed people to fight back even in the face of death. I'm not saying that we should die, but he did that. This is the heart of poetical science discourse at work, using the power of language to inspire, resist, and record history. And like McKay, we continue to use poetry to shape our future. Today, we see the intersection of poetry and politics in movements like Black Lives Matter, where chants, spoken word performances, and protest songs shape the narratives of resistance. These movements draw on the traditions of Douglass, Hughes, Lloyd, and McKay, blending art and activism in ways that move people to action. Poetical science discourse as a concept by itself is not entirely new. Historical figures like Ada Lovelace and John Wolfgang von Goethe integrated poetic thought into scientific inquiry. However, their approaches were deeply embedded in Eurocentric traditions, which primarily cater to elite, intellectual circles, and focus on the merging of abstract mathematics or philosophy with artistic expression. Ada Lovelace, often celebrated as the first computer programmer, viewed numbers not merely as quantitative measures, but as carriers of creativity and imagination. She believed that mathematical algorithms could express patterns akin to music or poetry. Lovelace poetical science was groundbreaking for her time, blending the technical with the imagination, but it remained within a framework that did not fully account for our lived human experiences, particularly the lived experiences of marginalized people. Goethe, the German polymath who embraced a form of poetical science, particularly in his study of color theory, he challenged the strict empiricalism of Isaac Newton by suggesting that human perception played a key role in understanding human phenomena. For Goethe, science and art were intertwined, and poetic imagination could reveal truth that empirical data alone could not. While Lovelace and Goethe visions of poetical science were celebrated for their intellectual depth, their contributions were largely confined to their personal intellectual exploration and primarily served a Eurocentric elitist perspective. They did not center marginalized voices or tackle the complexities of political science or colonialism or race. What sets A Square in my poetical science discourse apart is the centering of lived experiences, particularly the experiences of marginalized and oppressed people. Ph.D. is not merely about fusing creativity with science, as Lovelace's mathematical poetry or Goath's aesthetic science. Ph.D. is a method of inquiry that recognizes how culture, history, identity, and social structures are deeply embedded in our intellectual and political systems. So what does this mean for us today? It means we must embrace the power of political science and poetical science discourse, not only as an academic method, but as a way of living, seeing, and feeling the world. A Square calls us to do just that. To use poetry not only as an art form, but as a tool for intellectual and cultural survival. It invites us to bridge the gap between scholarly rigor and artistic expression, to speak truth to power in ways that both educate and inspire. Poetical science discourse isn't something to study. It's something to live. It's about recognizing that the systems that oppress us are built on language, and therefore language can be our greatest weapon against them. Our ancestors knew this. They wielded poetry and storytelling and song to resist, survive, and thrive. A Square, a scholarly poetical science discourse, my book, breaks those barriers and honors that legacy, showing that the fight for justice requires both intellect and heart, both reason and emotion. In A Squared, I challenge the traditional boundaries of academic research by elevating poetry as a powerful tool for social justice, resistance, and historical documentation. Poetical science discourse is not just about blending disciplines. It's about breaking down barriers that have long kept marginalized voices out of academic spaces. By embracing poetical science, we reclaim the right to tell our stories, to shape our narratives, and to document our histories. It reminds us that the power of scholarship is not only in its ability to analyze, but in its ability to move people to action. So let us continue this work. Let us be poets and scholars, revolutionaries and historians. Let us embrace the full power of poetical science discourse, knowing that through it, we can document our lives, fight for justice, and create the future of our ancestors' dream together. This is the power of A Squared, a scholarly poetical science discourse. And this is why it is a groundbreaking revolutionary message for everyone who has been kept out, who want to use history and poetry and hip hop and music and other forms of ethnographic research in their dissertations, in their research, and in their papers. Pick up a copy of A Squared today, and I would love to hear from you and hear your thoughts about how A Squared has impacted your work or how I can continue to grow as a scholar. Thank you.